It began as a quiet academic footnote buried in the margins of a historian's unpublished manuscript. But within days, that footnote had detonated inside palace circles, sending shockwaves through corridors long accustomed to silence. Because what it suggested wasn't minor, it was explosive. For decades, someone had been deliberately held back. And the name at the center of that revelation was Camilla Parker Bowles. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it sounded like the kind of theory that surfaces every few years, intriguing, provocative, but ultimately dismissed as academic speculation. Yet this was different. The historian behind the claim wasn't chasing headlines but tracing patterns, letters, annotations, fragments of correspondence that had quietly gathered dust for decades. And buried within those fragments were subtle but undeniable hints that Queen Elizabeth II herself may have played a far more active role in shaping Camilla's trajectory than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Not through declarations or dramatic gestures, but through silence, timing, and carefully measured distance. Inside palace walls, the reaction was immediate but not public. Aides who rarely revisited archival material suddenly found themselves combing through records with renewed urgency. Files once considered irrelevant were reopened. Conversations that had never been documented were suddenly being whispered about again, this time with a sharper edge. Because if even a fraction of the historian's claims were true, it would suggest that what the world believed to be a slow, organic rise was, in fact, something far more calculated and far more constrained. What made it even more unsettling was how quickly certain figures within the royal circle began to pay attention. Among them was Princess Anne, known for her sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty to institutional truth. Reports quiet, unconfirmed, but persistent suggested she was among the first to recognize the potential weight of these revelations. Not because they confirmed anything outright, but because they aligned too closely with patterns she had observed over years of navigating the same system. Patterns of delay, of careful positioning, of doors that opened for some and remained firmly closed for others. Meanwhile, on the palace gates, something else was happening. Media insiders, always attuned to the faintest tremors within royal dynamics, began to sense that this wasn't just another passing narrative. There was a shift, subtle but undeniable. Questions that once seemed settled were being asked again, this time with greater urgency. Why had certain moments unfolded the way they did? Why had timelines stretched when they could have been accelerated? And most importantly, who had the power to shape those outcomes from behind the scenes? The deeper the inquiry went, the clearer one thing became. This wasn't about a single decision or a single moment. It was about a sustained pattern, one that had quietly influenced the course of a life intertwined with the monarchy's most guarded inner workings. And as those patterns began to surface, they didn't just challenge perceptions, they threatened to redefine them. Because if Camilla had indeed been held back, deliberately and strategically, then the story wasn't just about her rise, it was about the forces that controlled it, the silence that protected it, and the truth that had remained just out of reach for far too long. But what began as a historian, his curiosity quickly unraveled into something far more deliberate and far more controlled than anyone had imagined. Long before the public ever accepted Camilla, there were signs, subtle, calculated, and unmistakably strategic. The Queen never spoke against her, but she didn't need to. Because according to newly surfaced interpretations, her silence wasn't neutrality, it was control. What now begins to surface is not a story of open resistance, but one of quiet orchestration where timing became a tool and absence became a message. In the early years, when speculation swirled and public sentiment remained sharply divided, Queen Elizabeth II maintained a distance that many interpreted as restraint. But insiders now suggest it was far more deliberate. Invitations that could have signaled early endorsement never came. Appearances that might have softened public perception were quietly withheld. It wasn't confrontation, it was calibration, and every move seemed to follow an unspoken design. There were moments fleeting, almost forgettable at the time, that now feel heavier under scrutiny. Key royal events, where Camilla's absence spoke louder than any official statement. Subtle protocol adjustment. T-ments that limited visibility without ever drawing attention. It created a paradox. A presence acknowledged privately yet restrained publicly. And within palace corridors, that distinction mattered more than anything said aloud. Because in an institution built on symbolism, what is not shown often carries the greatest meaning. Behind that restraint, another layer begins to emerge, one shaped not by a single voice, but by a network of adherents. Senior courtiers, long accustomed to reading between the lines, reportedly followed directives that were never formally written. Decisions were made not through commands, but through understanding and institutional instinct that preserved boundaries without ever needing to explain them. And in that environment, silence became policy. Compliance became tradition. And the line between guidance and control blurred beyond recognition. Among those who appeared to understand and perhaps even support this invisible structure was Princess Anne. Known for her unwavering commitment to duty, she represented a continuity of principle that prioritized the monarchy above all else. Reports suggest she viewed these limitations not as exclusion, but as necessary. Discipline, a way to protect the institution from instability during a time when public trust hung in delicate balance. If boundaries were drawn, they were drawn for a reason. And she, more than most, understood the cost of ignoring them. But what makes this revelation so compelling is not the restriction itself, it's the patience behind it. Because while the world perceived resistance, the monarchy was playing a longer, quieter game. Public opinion was not something to be forced, it was something to be shaped, slowly and deliberately. Each delay, each omission, each carefully managed appearance contributed to a gradual shift, one that would eventually transform skepticism into acceptance. Not overnight, not by accident, but through a process so controlled that it left no visible fingerprints. And now, as these patterns begin to align, the narrative changes. What once appeared hesitant now feels intentional. What seemed uncertain now appears precise. The silence that surrounded Camilla was never empty, it was filled with purpose, with calculation, with an understanding that timing could achieve what confrontation never could. And as that realization settles in, it raises a far more, an unsettling question. If acceptance was managed so carefully, then what else has been shaped in the same quiet, deliberate way? And while the public saw gradual acceptance, insiders now suggest it was anything but organic. It was managed, step by step, behind closed doors. When Camilla finally stepped into the spotlight, it looked like triumph. Years of controversy behind her, a coronation ahead. But what if that rise wasn't the natural conclusion of a love story, but the unintended breaking of a decades-long containment strategy? Because by the time Camilla Parker Bowles began to take her place at the center of royal life, the atmosphere around her had already shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly. Public resistance had softened, headlines had lost their edge, and the narrative that once defined her had been slowly rewritten. To the outside world, it appeared as evolution, the monarchy adapting to time and sentiment. But beneath that surface, a more complicated question lingered. Had acceptance truly been earned? Or had it been carefully engineered over years of controlled exposure, calculated absence, and deliberate patience? The turning point, many now argue, came with the late lie. Fee gesture from Queen Elizabeth II, a moment that seemed to seal Camilla's place within the institution. It was presented as a blessing, a final endorsement that aligned the monarchy with a future it could no longer delay. Yet even that moment, so publicly significant, has begun to attract new scrutiny. Was it an act of genuine approval, or the final move in a long, strategic process designed to stabilize a reality that had already been set in motion? Because by then, resistance within the institution had grown quieter, not necessarily weaker, but more contained. Inside those inner circles, the shift was not without tension. There were those who understood the necessity of adaptation, who believed that the monarchy had to evolve or risk losing its relevance entirely. And then there were those who saw something else unfolding, a gradual erosion of boundaries that had once defined order, hierarchy, and restraint. Among the latter, Princess Anne remained a steady, unyielding presence. Her approach had never wavered. Duty first, structure preserved. And as Camilla's role expanded, so too did the quiet concern that the careful limits once imposed were no longer being observed. That concern was never voiced openly, at least not in a way that reached the public. But reports of internal unease began to surface, subtle, fragmented, but persistent. Questions over influence, over visibility, over how far a role once cautiously managed was now being allowed to extend. Because power within the monarchy is rarely about titles alone, it is about proximity, perception, and the invisible authority that comes with both. And as Camilla stepped deeper into that space, it wasn't just her position that was changing, it was the balance itself. What makes this moment so charged is the contrast it reveals. For years, the system had worked to contain, to guide, to shape a path that would minimize disruption. And yet now, at the very point of apparent success, that same system seemed to be confronting the consequences of its own design. Because once a boundary is crossed, even gradually, it cannot easily be restored. And the question that now lingers is not whether Camilla rose. It is whether that rise has begun to challenge the very framework that once held it in check. And as those questions grow louder beneath the surface, they carry with them an undercurrent of uncertainty, one that tends to redefine not just a single role, but the fragile equilibrium that sustains the entire institution. Because as Camilla stepped further into power, those old, invisible lines began to blur, and not everyone was willing to let that happen. Then came the documents. Not rumors, not speculation, but layered, cross-referenced historical records that painted a picture too consistent to ignore. And suddenly, what had been whispers turned into something far more dangerous evidence. It didn't arrive all at once. It never does. Instead, it surfaced piece by piece, carefully assembled by a historian whose work had, until now, remained largely unnoticed. But this time, the patterns refused to stay buried. Timelines began to align in ways that felt too precise to dismiss. Correspondence, once considered routine, revealed subtle delays that no one had questioned before. Scheduling records hinted at intentional gaps, moments where appearances could have been made, but weren't. And at the center of it all stood Camilla Parker Bowles, not as an active architect of her own rise, but as someone whose path had been quietly shaped, slowed, and carefully managed. The more these records were examined, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't indecision. It was control exercised not through confrontation but through absence. Invitations withheld. Visibility reduced. Milestones delayed just enough to soften their impact. It was a strategy that thrived on subtlety, one that relied on the world never looking closely enough to question it. And for years, that strategy had worked. Public perception evolved at a pace that felt natural, unforced. But now, with these documents laid side by side, the illusion of spontaneity began to fracture. What makes these findings so difficult to ignore is their consistency. One record alone might be dismissed. Two might raise an eyebrow. But dozens, each reinforcing the same quiet pattern, begin to tell a story that demands attention. A story in which Queen Elizabeth II appears not as a passive observer, but as a steady, guiding force, one who understood that the stability of the monarchy depended not just on decisions, but on timing. And timing, as these records suggest, was never left to chance. As royal watchers began to connect these newly surfaced details with moments they had once taken at face value, the narrative shifted. Almost overnight, events that once seemed isolated now appeared linked. Choices that once felt reactive now seemed premeditated. And slowly, a new interpretation took hold, one that reframed the past not as a series of unrelated developments, but as a coordinated effort to shape the future without ever revealing the hand behind it. In that shifting landscape, the role of Princess Anne began to draw renewed attention. Her past actions, measured, consistent, often interpreted as rigid, now carried a different weight. What if they weren't simply expressions of personal conviction, but reflections of an understanding that others were never meant to see? Reports that once seemed routine now felt loaded with implication. Because if these boundaries were known, if they were understood at the highest levels, then those who upheld them were not just participants, they were guardians of a system built on quiet control. And as the media began to reframe the narrative, the tone changed. No longer was this a story of circumstance or gradual acceptance. It became something sharper, more deliberate. Words like strategy replaced evolution. Questions replaced assumptions. And with each new analysis, the distance between perception and reality grew harder to ignore. Now, the monarchy finds itself facing not a single revelation, but a cascade of them, each one pulling at threads that were never meant to unravel. Because if the past was managed this carefully, then what does that say about the present? And more importantly, who has always known where those lines were drawn and why they were never meant to be crossed? And as those revelations spread, one figure stood at the center, not as a bystander, but as someone who may have always known the truth. For years, she said nothing. No public statements. No visible reactions. Just unwavering discipline and quiet adherence to duty. But now, with the past being rewritten in real time, Princess Anne's silence was no longer seen as indifference. It looked like certainty. Because in a system where every gesture is scrutinized and every word is measured, silence can carry more weight than any declaration. And for Anne, silence had never been empty, it had always been intentional. While others adapted to shifting expectations and evolving public narratives, she remained anchored to something far older, far more rigid. Protocol, hierarchy, an unspoken understanding that the monarchy does not bend easily, and when it does, it risks losing more than it gains. For years, that position made her appear distant, even resistant. But now, as hidden patterns begin to surface, that same position feels less like resistance and more like foresight. Her actions, once interpreted as strict adherence to tradition, are now being re-examined through a different lens. Moments where she appeared to hold the line, to resist subtle expansions of influence surrounding Camilla Parker Bowles, no longer seem isolated or personal. They feel connected, aligned with a broader institutional rhythm that was never meant to be obvious. Because if the monarchy had indeed been managing a long, controlled integration, then those who maintained its boundaries were not opposing change, they were preserving its structure until the timing was right. That perspective changes everything. It transforms Anne from a peripheral figure into something far more central, a stabilizing force in a system built on careful balance. Royal insiders have begun to describe her in terms that carry quiet authority. Not as a challenger, not as a critic, but as a guardian. Someone who understood that continuity is not maintained through visibility, but through consistency. Through the willingness to stand firm when others are pulled by shifting tides. And in that role, her silence becomes not just understandable but necessary. What makes this shift so powerful is how it resonates beyond palace walls. Public sentiment, once indifferent or even dismissive of her approach, has begun to evolve. There is a growing recognition that strength does not always announce itself. That discipline, maintained over years without acknowledgement, carries its own form of resilience. And as new interpretations of the past gain traction, Anne's position begins to feel less like an outlier and more like the foundation upon which everything else was built. Yet with that recognition comes something else, an undercurrent of tension that refuses to fade. Because if Anne upheld the original boundaries, if she remained aligned with the intent that shaped them, then what happens when those boundaries begin to blur? What happens when the structure she helped preserve is tested by the very changes it once sought to control? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that linger, that deepen, that suggest the story is far from resolved. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so significant. Because vindication is not just about proving something right, it is about revealing what was at stake all along. It is about understanding that every decision, every silence, every act of restraint was part of a larger design, one that is only now coming into focus. And as that design becomes clearer, it forces a reckoning not just with the past, but with the future that is still unfolding, still uncertain, still shaped by forces that remain just beyond view. But vindication doesn't just rewrite the past, it reshapes the present. And the consequences of these revelations were only just beginning. There was no official statement, no denial, no clarification. Just silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any press release. And within that silence, something shifted inside the palace walls. Because when questions rise to a certain level, when they begin to touch not just individuals, but the architecture of the institution itself, the response is rarely immediate. And in this case, Buckingham Palace chose restraint. No comment on the historian's findings. 3. No effort to dismantle the narrative taking shape beyond its gates. Instead, a deliberate stillness settled in, one that felt less like uncertainty and more like containment. As if the absence of response was itself a message carefully measured, precisely timed, and impossible to ignore. Inside that quiet, instructions reportedly moved quickly. Senior aides, long trained in the art of controlled communication, were said to have been guided away from engagement. No clarifications, no off-the-record briefings, no subtle corrections to the growing speculation. It was a withdrawal not from the situation but from the conversation surrounding it. And in doing so, the palace allowed the narrative to expand unchecked, knowing full well that silence, in moments like these, can amplify rather than diminish. Outside those walls, the effect was immediate. Media outlets, sensing the vacuum, filled it with analysis, interpretation, and increasingly bold conclusions. Royal observers, many of whom had spent years decoding even the smallest gestures, began to treat the silence not as absence, but as intent. Because within an institution that has mastered the language of implication, saying nothing, G can often mean everything. And what it seemed to suggest now was not denial but deliberation. At the same time, subtle shifts began to emerge, small, almost imperceptible changes that might have gone unnoticed under different circumstances. Appearances adjusted. Positions recalibrated. The balance of visibility altered just enough to raise questions without providing answers. It wasn't a dramatic reaction. It didn't need to be. Because within a system built on precision, even the smallest adjustment carries weight. And those adjustments, taken together, hinted at something unfolding beneath the surface, something being reassessed, restructured, perhaps even reconsidered. At the center of that tension remained figures whose roles now felt more significant than ever. Camilla Parker Bowles, whose journey had already been re-examined through the lens of control and strategy, now found herself positioned within a narrative that refused to settle. And Princess Anne, whose consistency had once been overlooked, now appeared as a fixed point in an environment suddenly filled with uncertainty. Their presence, their positioning, their silence, it all began to carry new meaning. What makes this moment so charged is not what has been confirmed, but what has been left unsaid. Because within that silence lies possibility. Possibility of acknowledgement, of resistance, of recalibration that has yet to reveal itself. And as the days pass without clarification, the tension does not fade, it deepens. It evolves. It presses against the boundaries of what can remain hidden and what must eventually surface. And so the silence continues, not empty, not passive, but deliberate. A pause that feels less like hesitation and more like calculation. Because when an institution built on legacy chooses silence, it's rarely accidental, it's calculated. Power in the royal family isn't always visible. It doesn't shout, it adjusts, quietly, decisively. And as this narrative unfolded, those invisible lines of influence began to move once again. What makes this moment so striking is not the presence of conflict, but the precision of response. As the revelations surrounding control, timing, and carefully managed perception continue to ripple outward, the monarchy appears to be doing what it has always done best, recentering itself without ever appearing to move. The focus, once drifting toward interpret, caution and speculation, is subtly being drawn back to something more grounded, more enduring. Hierarchy. Not as an abstract concept, but as a living framework that defines who leads, who follows, and how power is ultimately understood within the institution. In that quiet recalibration, Princess Anne's presence feels increasingly significant. Not louder, not more visible, but undeniably more central. Her long-standing commitment to duty, once perceived as rigid, now reads as alignment, an embodiment of the structure the monarchy seems determined to reaffirm. Decisions that once appeared routine now carry a deeper implication, as if they are part of a broader effort to stabilize something that had begun to shift. Because when uncertainty enters the narrative, consistency becomes its counterweight. And Anne, in her unchanging approach, offers exactly that. At the same time, questions surrounding Camilla Parker Bowles continue to evolve, not in terms of presence, but in terms of permanence. Her position, once defined by gradual acceptance, is now being viewed through a different lens. Legacy. Where does her influence settle in the long term? How does it integrate into a system that prioritizes continuity over individual trajectory? These are not questions that invite immediate answers. They linger. They deepen. And they suggest that the story is no longer about ascent, but about placement, about where lines are drawn and who determines their limits. Beyond the palace, the public conversation has begun to reflect this tension. It is no longer simply about personalities or past controversies. It has become something more fundamental, a quiet debate between duty and adaptation, between preserving what has always been and reshaping it for what comes next. And in that debate, the monarchy appears to be leaning toward caution, toward reinforcement rather than expansion. Not rejecting change, but controlling its pace. Not denying evolution, but defining its boundaries. Because within this institution, roles are rarely personal. They are inherited, shaped by history, and guided by expectations that extend far beyond any single individual. The idea that influence can be molded by personal narrative alone is being quietly challenged. Instead, a different truth begins to emerge, one in which legacy dictates direction, and where even the most significant shifts must align with a framework that predates them all. And as these adjustments take hold, they do so without announcement, without spectacle. A shift in emphasis here, a recalibration there. Nothing dramatic, yet everything meaningful. Because power, in this context, is not about visibility, it is about control. About ensuring that even in moments of uncertainty, the structure remains intact. And as those lines settled into place, one truth became impossible to ignore: the past had never truly been buried.